that was the view really for decades, that civilization began about 6,000 years ago. And before that, there was no such thing as civilization. And they say that the first big megalithic structures were created by societies that were already agricultural societies. So they were generating surpluses, which allowed specialists to have the time to learn how to be architects and engineers and builders. But then suddenly, out of the blue, comes Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old. It's 5,000 years old than the supposed oldest megalithic structures. And it's an enormous megalithic structure, probably the biggest megalithic structure on Earth, because so much of it is still underground, although we know what's there because of ground penetrating radar. Highly sophisticated, 20-ton pillars, beautiful astronomical alignments, deliberately buried by the people who created it. They ran it for about 1,000 years, and then they deliberately buried it. And archaeology is still struggling to explain this. They've now had to say, well, okay, somehow megalithic architecture began thousands of years before we thought it began. How are we going to explain this? And they have to accept that when the work began on Gobekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, the entire population there were hunter-gatherers. They were not agriculturalists, generating those supposed surpluses that would allow experts in architecture to emerge. They were hunter-gatherers. And how, in God's name, do a group of hunter-gatherers wake up one morning and create something like this enormous scale? And then the mystery deepens, because at the same time that they're building the megalithic site, they're also suddenly doing agriculture. And I look at that as a contrarian. And I say, I actually don't think that this was something that was just dreamed up overnight by a group of hunter-gatherers. I think I'm looking at a transfer of technology. I think people came to that site who already knew how to do this stuff. And maybe they used that site to mobilize the local population, to push them into a new direction. And that was truly the beginnings of civilization as we know it. But I think it was a restarting of civilization, a reboot, not the actual beginnings. I think there was an earlier lost civilization. It's an incredibly important day because the Younger Dryas begins 12,800 years ago with a cataclysm, with a puzzling, mysterious rise in sea level at the same point, 1,000 years of freezing temperatures, mass extinctions of animal species all over the world, and then 11,600 years ago, global temperature shoots up. The last of the ice caps collapse into the sea. Sea level rises enormously. That is the date that work starts at Gobekli Tepe, and that is precisely the date that Plato, which is the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis, that's precisely the date he gives for the destruction of Atlantis, 11,600 years before our time. He puts it this way, that his ancestor Solon visited Egypt, and we know about that visit. It's historically recorded. That visit to Egypt was in 600 BC, and there Solon claimed to have been told by Egyptian priests about this great advanced civilization that once existed, but that angered the gods and was destroyed in an enormous flood. And Solon asked those Egyptian priests, when did this happen? And they said, 9,000 years ago. Well, do the math. That's in 600 BC. That's 9,000 years before 600 BC. We call that 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's exactly the date of the end of the Younger Dryas, and it's exactly the date of what is called Meltwater Pulse 1b, one of the biggest single rises overnight in sea level that ever occurred. So if Plato made it up, it's really weird that he picked a date that is precisely a date that coincides with the latest geological evidence on cataclysmic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age.
And there's plenty of evidence that there were many sites like this that were thought to be just legend and myth, like Troy, for instance. Mm-hmm. That has now been proven to be an actual real city that mimics the initial descriptions of it.
The story of Atlantis is not alone. There are thousands of traditions from all around the world speaking of a global flood that destroyed a former civilization, that brought to an end a golden age. That's what Ancient Apocalypse is all about. It's why it's called Ancient Apocalypse, because that's what it ultimately comes down to. When you talk of a lost civilization, how did it become lost? What happened that took it away, that obliterated it from human memory? And this apocalyptic episode called the Younger Dryas is the answer to that. The point I often make, which I think is worth making again and again, is how different the world was during the Ice Age. The Sahara Desert was green. It was a fertile place. Nobody's doing much archaeology in the Sahara Desert today. The Amazon rainforest, 5 million plus square kilometers under deep canopy. Hardly any archaeology is being done there. And yet we know from LiDAR surveys that there are enormous structures under that canopy. And then what about sea level rise? 400 feet sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. The prime real estate on Earth, 27 million square kilometers, it's about 10 million square miles, were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. And again, that was the time when all the great megafauna went extinct, the saber-toothed tigers, the woolly rhinos, and so on and so forth. They all went extinct between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And there's evidence of just utterly cataclysmic flooding. And that flooding came off the ice cap, and something made it come off the ice cap really, really fast. And the question is, what caused it? Why did it happen then? And there's a very powerful theory, which is now backed by more than 100 mainstream scientists, that the Earth passed through the debris stream of a disintegrating comet. And that theory is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And those several bits of that disintegrating comet might have been pretty big, maybe up to 1 kilometer in diameter. And they landed on the North American ice cap, generating huge amounts of heat. Tremendous shock wave hits the ice cap, and it turns that ice into water, and it rushes down southwards, fills up these lakes, overflows these lakes, and tears up the landscape underneath it. And this Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is by far, in my view, the best explanation of what's going on.
When you go back to what you think are the origins of sophisticated civilization, how far back are we talking?
As science progresses, we are finding evidence that the human species is much older than we thought. Go back 25, 30 years, you'll find people telling you that anatomically modern humans didn't exist until 50,000 years ago. Then they found evidence of anatomically modern humans 196,000 years ago. Then in Morocco, they found evidence of anatomically modern humans 300,000 years ago. Humans just like us, with the same brains, the same capacities, the same abilities than us. Once you start extending that timeline back, you're leaving much more room for an advanced civilization to emerge, a civilization that was ultimately destroyed. If you've just got 50,000 years to do it in, it doesn't leave you much space. But if you've got 300,000 years to play with, there's plenty of space. So bottom line, I think this was a civilization that flourished during the Ice Age, that occupied the prime real estate during the Ice Age along coastlines, and that was obliterated almost completely in the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas. There were survivors. Those survivors left their fingerprints in places like Gobekli Tepe. After the Younger Dryas was over, they then sought to initiate hunter-gatherers into their system of knowledge.